Hi, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all our participants who are joining in from different parts of the globe. My name is Redan Resho, and I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Informal Urbanism Research Hub, or InfUr, within the Faculty of Architecture, Building, and Planning here at the University of Melbourne. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where this event is being hosted, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Let me also acknowledge leaders of other indigenous communities who may be here with us this evening. Today's lecture is part of the InfUr's international webinar series titled The Paradox of Informal Urbanism. I'm delighted to be welcoming Professor Fran Tonkiss, who is a global leader in the fields of urban and economic sociology. Fran is a professor and head of the Department of Sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her research interests focus on urban inequalities, urban development and design, social and spatial divisions, and the socio-economic organization of urban space. Some of her published books include Cities by Design, The Social Life of Urban Form, Space, The City and Social Theory, and Contemporary Economic Sociology, Globalization, Production, and Inequality. Fran is also managing editor of Economy and Society and a member of the editorial board of the British Journal of Sociology. Her lecture today is titled Idioms of Informality. She will speak for about 40 minutes and then we will open the virtual floor to questions. So Fran, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Redden, and thank you to you and Kim and the team for the invitation to participate in this series and in the wider work of the Hub. I'm going to start to share my screen. And I'm going to be reliant on you to call out to let me know if anything is amiss with that share. It is fantastic to be here, to join you in your evening, my morning, and wherever else you may be around the world. I should also say these are unusual times, of course, and I'm joining you in unusual circumstances. I'm currently in isolation, and which means I'm confined to these four walls, and this is relevant. Connectivity is not what it might be. So if there are any glitches, Redden will step in, but hopefully the connection will hold for the time that we have. For that reason, I'm going to try and keep things fairly concise and to make sure we have time for discussion, as also in order to troubleshoot any technicalities technical problems that we might encounter. So it's great to be with you in Melbourne in a way, and other parts of Australia and other parts of the world from this very small space. I'm also very conscious that it's now early evening in Melbourne and you are in a position, those of you who are there, to actually go out and enjoy your evenings now, so I don't want to detain you from that important business either. What I want to do though in the next half hour, let's say, is to engage with some of the work that the InfUr Hub has been doing, and which I have been following, and I've been following Kim Dovey's work for a very long time, coming at it from a different angle, aiming slightly off in terms of scale, in terms of my point of focus, and in terms of my context of interest. And I'm going to say something a bit more about that in a moment. But my starting point is really inspired by the concern that the Hub researchers have to treat informal settlement, as Dovey and colleagues put it in a recent piece, as a verb. In that spirit, I want to approach informality, informal urbanism, primarily as a practice. To think of informal urbanism not primarily as a condition, although of course it is a physical, a material, and a social and an economic condition, but as a practice or a set of practices and a set of very ordinary, everyday practices. In this piece from 2020, the piece on informal settlement as euphemism, Dovey et al. Note, as others have, that informality is the primary mode of urban production today. And this is true, of course, in the majority world. But forms of informal urbanism, informal design practices, informal economic, housing, and infrastructure practices are also increasingly critical strategies and very common strategies in rich world cities. And that's going to be my focus today. So I want to aim away from the majority world lens that much of the work of InfUr Hub focuses on, and certainly Alfredo Brienberg's talk and Malik Mon's talk was focusing on earlier on in this series, and think about this as a trans world practice, as it were. This is the first key point of difference for me. The second is that while the InfUr Hub researchers are interested in very compelling ways in the morphogenesis of informal settlements, how these forms take shape over time out of the bits and pieces of city, of blocks, of plots, of buildings, of streets, of lanes, of points of access and egress, and so on. And I'm also interested in this generative sense of informality. But I want to see it, informality, as emergent, in a sense, from practice. So my concern then is the way in which these basic morphologies, these patterns and shapes of contemporary urban living emerge from practices of non-expert design, processes of unregulated development, and acts of unofficial planning. And in moving from morphologies to practices, I also want to play a little bit with this idea of informal settlement as euphemism, to retain that dimension of language and how we think about language. So in the move from morphology to practice, I want to see this as a move from the grammar of urbanism, the structuring shape of urban form, to an idiomatic approach to informality, the way in which informality is articulated through practices, the forms of design expression that pick up on traces of informality. So I'm interested here in processes of design in translation, not simply to say that high-income cities can learn from the urban practices of the global South, although certainly my concern is to stress that direction of travel in thinking about repertoires of urbanism and repertoires of urban practice. But to think about informality as a lingua franca, as a common language of urbanism across different cities, at very different scales, at very different levels of income, with very different degrees of planning and legal capacity. And to focus on urban design in its guise as practice, as much in its expression as form. So my focus then picks up on the work of researchers at the Hub, but departs in it in two ways. First of all, in taking informality primarily as a practice-based concept, and then also moving from the settlement scale, often at quite a large, I was going to say a neighborhood scale, but actually quite at large parts of the city that the InfUr Hub researchers are concerned with, to looking at this finer grain politics of practice and of use. And I want to finish by also touching on some of the themes that Alfredo Brienberg was focusing on, which have to do with what this might mean for design education. I was quite struck when reading through recent publications, including the big one on the large-scale comparative study that was published in the last year, of the reference to the way in which a gathering field of researchers on informal urbanism are using techniques of remote sensing to discern, detect, to pattern, to map patterns of informal settlement, particularly in low-income contexts. And this is not the tactic that the InfUr hub researchers are using. They start from Google Maps and move from there over time, still using this kind of big data. But in thinking about this remote sensing technology, I was struck by the recent coverage. This is in the UK press. For those of you who are not familiar with the rich and varied landscape of the United Kingdom press, the Daily Express is a right-wing tabloid, and it is publishing here a piece which is showing heat maps generated from police helicopters of human habitation in non-housing spaces. So this is just a chunk of the city out in West London, viewed from the air, and it is using heat maps to detect where people are living in spaces which do not have permission, which are unregulated, the so-called beds in sheds. The interest of the Daily Express in this, of course, is not at all in the generative aspects of informal urbanism, but in the policing and punitive aspects of what it doesn't call squatting, but illegal housing. And this, of course, is linked with an anti-immigration politics and rhetoric as well. And these kinds of typologies of beds in sheds, of informal housing in one of the richest cities in the world, ranges from the petit rentier capitalism of those who want to rent out their outbuildings for fairly mass occupation often, to people trying to accommodate large and extended families in the conditions of overcrowding, which Colin McFarlane spoke about in his speech. This is just to point very much in passing and quite anecdotally to, of course, the way that informality is a common and normal urban condition. And as the work of Dovey and others has pointed out, we always need to think about informality as being imbricated with the formal, as being oftentimes co-produced, but certainly coexistent and co-located. And this is truly the case in a rich world city such as London. So I want to draw out these, what I'm calling 4 idioms of informality, which I hesitate to call principles. All of these are absolutely established in the literature. I am not coining these, but I want to highlight them and throw them into relief, to think about these not as they are often framed as instances of poor world urbanism, but as an increasingly standard shared repertoire of urban design practices by non-expert and by expert designers across the rich and poor world. And these 4 idioms, which I'm sure you will all recognize from the literature, from your own research, are the incremental, the improvised, the impermanent, and the insurgent. And I want to retain these concepts in their adjectival form, again, with that commitment to thinking about these as practices rather than conditions. Let me run through each of these fairly briefly before coming to how I think they might speak to design education. Incrementalism is a very well-established feature of informal urbanism worldwide, and informal settlement patterns in particular. It's often thought about in terms of incrementalism by accretion, the gradual encroachment across space, the drawdown of land, the addition either horizontally or vertically of extra rooms, extra structures, extra buildings, until an informal settlement is built out in quite a consolidated fashion, or until a house is built out to become a block in an urban morphology. I also want to think about incrementalism in terms of use, in terms of the diverse, accretive, and hybrid ways in which use can be established incrementally within space as well as across it. And the example here I use is from one of my colleagues, Susie Hall's works on the super diverse street. This is an ethnographic study, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, and Susie's work since then, of a street in South London, a diverse but a very ordinary, normal high street in South London. And she draws here very nicely, freehand, the interior of this improvised emporium. This is a fairly large corner shop front, which has been ramified and which has been hybridized through different kinds of uses. And again, there is small scale subletting going on without the framework of planning, such that what is a large retail space accommodates also a nail salon, a money transfer desk, a hair salon, mobile phone supplier, and so on. In instancing this form of incrementalism, the incrementalism of use, I'm struck by the parallel in Hall's approach, where she talks about the way in which these hybrid interiors, as she attempted to map them, simply defeated the standard land use and retail categories that were available to her within a standard planning framework. Struck by the resonance with a line from the recent piece by Kaun Pafka and Dovey on Old Dhaka, which talks about the vertical accretion of built space in the old city, and the way in which a complex mix emerges horizontally, but also vertically, and where retail functions extend many stories above the street, and the concept of singular land use is largely irrelevant. Now, I bring these two quotes together in these two instances from London and Dhaka together, not in order, I hope, to draw a false equivalence, but to remark on that sort of idiomatic resonance between these informal practices and these strategies of everyday design, the division of space, the designs on space that emerge out of use and which bear family resemblances in very different economic settings, in very different legal and planning settings, but as recognizable repertoires of design practice. This space is more or less improvised, more or less formalized. And I just want to rest now on that aspect of this kind of practice, the improvisational quality of these spaces. We are very familiar with the ways in which available space, accessible space, drawdownable space in unregulated contexts may be appropriated for various kinds of use. But this is also the case in often very overplanned and highly regulated cities. We see the appropriation and the adaptation of spaces for new or alternative uses. The ways in which places of commerce, of congregation and faith, of conviviality and civility come to take shape in sites that have been laid out for other purposes, that have been planned to other intentions and directed towards different designs. Design in this sense becomes an effect of use rather than an objective in planning. And the simple illustration here is the local mosque around the corner for me, which has repurposed an existing storefront as a place of congregation and of prayer and of meeting for members of the local Muslim community. And this is a very typical form of adaptation that we see particularly in spaces of religious congregation. So the places of retail, people's front rooms, sheds, as we saw before, retail parks, empty spaces being animated as spaces of congregation and of faith, often on a temporal basis, in this case on a permanent basis, and here within a permissive planning framework. So in thinking about improvisational space, I'm concerned with the way that this design idiom makes space through practices of use, rather than thinking about design as a projection of future uses. To draw out a third element of this idiomatic approach to informal design, that of impermanence. Again, a concept that we find very frequently in the literature on informality, and more generally, and a much wider literature on temporary uses and interim and meanwhile uses. I don't want to rehearse the latter part of that literature here, and I'm sure I don't need to in this company, but I do want to stress the underlying point that these spatial designs are, of course, also designs in and on time. They work with time, they work through temporal formats as well as through spatial formats. And these temporal formats are very critical to the way in which spatial forms come to be produced, such that making space is itself a matter of making in and of time. Indeed, we need to think about temporary design often as about a design on empty time, as well as about an occupation of vacant space. We think about these spatial infills, but these are also temporal infills of underutilized land, of derelict buildings, or of stagnant development sites. We're very familiar with these, of course, in a high income context, but I don't want to think of these simply as meanwhile uses, but the attempt to establish permanence through these spatial designs on time, which I have coined mean to stay uses. Permanence is not guaranteed. Design is always provisional. Occupation is contingent, but there is an intention to establish a form of stability, security, and a de facto tenure through what Simone called a politics of habitation. It reminds us that impermanence, of course, provisionality, is the normal condition of urbanism, rather than some kind of irregular, unofficial, or illegal state. And it's important here, I guess, when thinking about the paradoxes of informal urbanism, to aim off some of the more camera-ready, Insta-friendly, and design aesthetic versions of the interim use and the pop-up impermanent form. The kinds of flash retails or urban beaches or parklets that we're all, I'm sure, very familiar with in cities such as Melbourne or London. And don't get me wrong, I have absolutely nothing against these design forms. On the contrary, but they often have a quite different relationship to legality and insecurity, a more confident relationship, for example, to one's potential encounter with the police or planning authorities, and a more easy affinity with the conventions of expert design than the more insecure, impermanent encroachments that are typical of the urban informality in so many urban contexts across the world, including in these high-income cities. Finally, then, the fourth idiomatic expression of informal design I want to cite here is the insurgent. Again, something that we find frequently in the literature in this field. And this is partly in order to address this paradox that these repertoires of informal urbanism have been appropriated, maybe too strong a word, taken up by often quite privileged urban actors, and increasingly by expert designers, by official planners, or by government agencies. Some of the most striking, important, and consequential designs on urban space that we have seen in the last decade or more have come out of strategies of occupation, of protest, of mobilization, of insurgency, whether these are directed against specifically urban issues, whether these are directed against broader environmental issues. I'm thinking about the kinds of infrastructural activism that we're seeing at the moment in the UK, in London and the UK more broadly, mobilizations against fuel poverty, the movement Insulate Britain, which is blocking major street thoroughfares and highways in order to try and drive its message home on climate crisis and the risks of fuel poverty. These kinds of protests, and this is the latest in a long catalogue of these globally, also take on more permanent forms or more mean to stay forms through longer term occupations and insurgent designs on existing spaces. So these improvised and meanwhile designs on space are not simply the prerogative of experimental designers in more privileged urban contexts, but they are part of a much broader, I would say more ordinary and certainly less expert set of spatial practices that cut across standard distinctions between low and high income settings, between relatively informal and relatively more formal urbanism. In context of deepening urban disparity, of increasing state withdrawal, of crushingly punitive austerity, a range of urban actors in many rich world cities draw on what have been seen as the repertoires of poor world urbanism in order to advance claims to space in insistent and insurgent ways, through occupation and through the politics of habitation. The image I have here is drawn this time not from London, but from Naples. This is a social centre established in a former secure psychiatric unit, and you see here the former visiting room. This was a military establishment, which, like a lot of the military estate in Italy, is redundant, unused, and has been taken over by social actors, again with a contingent relationship to official planning, depending on which city they happen to be in and how long established they have been. And you can see that they've reworked the visiting room here as a reading room. So insurgent urbanism asks us to think about design as a form of direct action in the city, through the emplacement of the body, through to the occupation, for a short time, for a longer time, on a mean to stay basis, as an insurgent act. So let me think then about, or draw out a little, why I think this might be relevant for those of you who are engaged in design, research, and education. There are 2 points I want to make before turning to these closing ones, and it's to reflect just on those very small vignettes that I've run through in the short time that we have this evening. The first is that all of the examples that I've used are by non-expert designers. They are all, as I would claim, works of design, but none of them have been produced by architects, by urban designers, or by planners. So this approach to the understanding idioms of informality as quite central to everyday as well as orthodox practices of design asks us to engage with a broad conception of who we think is the designer, who is engaged in acts of design. The second point I want to make based on these vignettes is, of course, to draw out the fact that they have quite variable relationships to planning and legality, that some of these exist within the spirit, if not the letter, of a planning framework. Some of them have a degree of pro tem planning permission. Others are enjoying the kind of benign neglect of a permissive planning system that will turn its back on various contraventions or irregularities. And this is something that is also stressed in the work of the InfUr Hub researchers, I'm aware, that we need to think about this in terms of a variable continuum rather than planning is on and off, or the law is absent or it is present. Having made those 2 points, then let me draw out some principles which I think we might underline for design education. The first of these is to take all that design as being always provisional and the work of the designer as always unfinished. Indeed, the provisionality of design, giving up an attachment to permanence, may well be in the interests of the sustainability of design over the long term. The physical, but also the social durability of design may in large part depend on the degree to which it lends itself to adaptations and accretions over time of the kind which we've seen. It follows from this that collaboration is open-ended and that not all collaborators are known or present to each other. I was struck at the end of Alfredo Brienberg's talk when he was talking about his project in the Cape Town context, and he showed a map of all of the actors involved in this initiative. And it was a very ramified network of different players. And we often think about the informal as having to do with the small scale, the sole actor, or of uncoordinated action. Of course, Brienberg's graphic shows us just how many hands are involved in the work of informal and provisional design. And the fact that this extends over time means that this collaboration is, in principle, open. Thirdly, we need to approach design and planning not in terms of prescriptions over use or prescriptions over users, but in terms of affordance. This links to the fourth point. What do planning and design make possible in a space? Thinking about design as creating conditions of possibility rather than composing fixed spatial scripts or identifying very rigid end users. In closing then, I want to stress the way in which these informal practices of design are indeed majority practices the world over, and they're often referred to in terms of a kind of a minor urbanism. Certainly they are not minor in respect of the share that they take of housing provision in the majority world, of urban infrastructure in many rapidly growing urban contexts, or of the share of urban economic exchange and urban labor markets and production. But they are minor in the sense that they are often seen as marginal and in certain cases, even decorative in the context of dominant design rhetorics. What the work of this center and of the researchers associated with it suggests, of course, is that these kinds of minor practices are the normal mode of making cities today. Thank you all for your engagement.
Fascinating. Thanks, Fran, for that very insightful presentation. So we're now ready to take questions from the participants. We actually have plenty of time for discussion, so that's great. And I think I will first invite John Dave to ask his question. So if you could turn on your camera and microphone.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is more a broader question. Can the boys from Glasgow, or more importantly, the people who vote for them, take us to the place where we need to be?
I can only answer, thank you, John, for the question. I can only answer from a personal standpoint rather than an analytical one. I think the short answer is no. But I certainly think that the work of those who are the kind of the activism that is seeking to influence those agendas is absolutely crucial. It doesn't mean that that's not meaningful and it doesn't make a change. And I'm quite struck. I don't know about you. You might have a further comment to make on that. That every bit of heating that can be prevented is worth doing. I often quote in a different kind of context when talking about informality and provisional design, the words of Liza Fior, the urban designer from MAF Art and Architecture here in London, when she talks about her engagement with some of these sort of temporary uses and the knowledge that these are not going to last necessarily over time. And she says, you know, 2 years is a long time in the life of a child. And if you can make a difference in that time, any difference is worth making. And I think that kind of orientation to time is a very important one in relation to environmental issues as well, that small acts and small changes nevertheless are worth making. What's going on in Glasgow now, I don't have a great deal of confidence.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to be convinced otherwise.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Fran, and thanks, Jan, for that question. I'll now go to Samuel Holleran.
You notice I didn't mention Scott Morrison there, Red, and I restrained myself because, you know, I'm in no position to speak at this end.
Hi, I had a quick question regarding the sort of harnessing of these minor practices, or these practices that you've called minor. I feel like there's a lot of initiatives now that are kind of looking at the issue area expertise of lay people, particularly in the built environment, as being more meaningful, and are trying to get them into processes where they can contribute. I'm wondering how, what happens to these informal practices when they're brought in, and what does that process look like by which you give people a voice? I'm thinking particularly of built environment improvements where park users and others are invited to, you know, someone will say, you're the person who walks through this park every day. Where should the bins be? Where should the lighting be? But maybe also, is there a way to actually scale that? So it's not just where do we put the bin, but how can we spend $1 million of capital improvements?
Yeah, the question of scale is a really important one there. Thank you, Samuel. You know, this, of course, is a very standard gesture in much urban design and development today, and one can be rather cynical about it, and it's important, I think, to be critical and questioning of it. Having said that, I think it's absolutely vital. I was less concerned here with thinking about that sort of incorporation of, you know, putative or projected users in design strategies than, I guess, thinking about how we might learn from the everyday practices of non-expert design in the practice of more, you know, expert designers. And I'm sort of conscious of the arguments that Andrew Ross has made about the way in which so much work now is, you know, a lot of the work of consultation is sort of outsourcing design labor to unpaid participants and community members. And, you know, the people who are holding the flip charts and handing out the Post-it notes are being paid, and the people who are actually participating and contributing their knowledge are not being paid. So it's important to be aware of those kinds of inequities in that model. Not that I'm suggesting you should pay people to come and be consulted. There are clearly risks in that move. In terms of how it gets scaled up, partly it is about seeing these kinds of processes precisely as processes of consultation, of engagement, rather than you know, i.e. in a sense that a process is something that can go in different directions, right? That it is not something which is predetermined and it's part of the development plan, and you've done the consultation and you've done the stakeholder engagement, and nothing changes as a consequence of that. But a process, by definition, is something which is undetermined in terms of its outcome. So there needs to, the idea that design should be open-ended is germane to the notion that these forms of engagement should be open and undetermined, non-determined from the outset. I'm a firm believer that, you know, oftentimes if what users wanted was taken seriously, we would have more spaces for smoking in our common public spaces. We would have more spaces for dog littering. We would have more spaces for doing, you know, low-key drug deals, and probably less kite flying and rollerblading or whatever the visualizations of designers often show. We would also regrettably probably have a lot more space for car parking, and that's not something that I would endorse. So I think the user is not king in that respect, or queen, but is of course part of this open-ended collaboration which design involves. And I'm not sure that scale is such a formidable challenge in that sense. If we take the analogy of deliberative budgeting at city scale, we have instances where quite large scale city budgets, not the whole budget ever, but you know, but significant amounts of public budgets are determined through community deliberation. So that sort of scale and model certainly would translate into the urban design context.
Okay, so thanks Samuel for that question and Fran for addressing it. Okay, we have a lot of questions now, and let's go to Rajas V. Gandhi. Do you want to ask your question? So please turn on your camera.
Hi, unfortunately, I can't turn my camera on at the moment. My camera does not work on this laptop. I hope that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is, you're talking about informality as being impermanent. Would you also say it's liminal the way Victor Turner talks about liminality in rituals? And would you say that this impermanence or this liminality creates certain structures in informality that we can observe, we can map, especially in an ethnographic study? So in a way, I see like this could be a contradictory thing, because we are talking about informality as being impermanent, but we're also talking about informality creating certain structures. So I was curious to see what your view is on that.
Thank you for that. And we do have a very nice image of you, even if we don't have you on camera. Thanks, Rajasvi. I'm not sure I would see informality as liminal. It can be, you know, if thinking about liminality as being about a sort of a threshold, a transitional space. Certainly, I think this would be one of the articulations of informality, but I tend to see informality as very normal, as very present, as very mundane. And so liminality may be one of its expressions, but I'm not sure it's a defining feature of informality. And I think, I hope I'm not sort of misusing the work of the hub researchers, but I think that larger scale work that is being done here on morphologies of informality would also really centers informality, rather than seeing it as liminal or marginal, even though it may be spatially peripheral in certain cases. The second point, I'm just going to, about whether it can be mapped in observable patterns. Yes, I mean, this is something I would have liked to have said more about had I allowed myself a bit more time, but I'm quite struck by Abdulmalik Simon's approach to this, the way in which he says these sort of, and I'm not going to be able to reproduce the very poetic language that he uses, but it was very evocative, the way in which these contingent, these unpredictable, these unregulated patternings of life in the majority urban world, as he puts it, but I think of urban life generally, establish this observable pattern and this observable, he wouldn't use the word structure, but these regularities, and to a degree these reliabilities. And I think his interest was in things that the actors can rely on, these ways of being, of acting, of interacting, that individuals and collectives are able to reliably expect in their everyday interactions, rather than perhaps analysts come along and observe. But I think it does hold in that extended way. And, you know, I'm a sociologist, so I think that you know, the whole sort of distinction between informality and formality, in a sense, is not meaningful in a sociological sense, because people establish order and they establish patterns through repetitions, through interactions, through shared expectations. They don't always work. They're not always reliable, but they don't need to be formalized to hold. And indeed, some of the most informal social patternings can be the most tenacious, can have the firmest grip on you. You know, it can be much harder to get out of an effective relationship than a legal contract, for example. So I think that the accretion, to use that word again, of practice, of contact, and of routine establishes this kind of, you know, permanence through the provisional.
Okay, thanks. For our next question, let me invite Kim Dovey to.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you, Redden, and thank you so much, Fran, for agreeing to this talk and delivering such a great set of ideas to engage with. I wanted to pick up on this notion of design education, and I'm guessing that you've spent enough time around architecture and planning schools to understand a bit about the context there, and what I would probably call the paradox of design education, where you know, to argue for a not fixed outcome, for an impermanent outcome, is in some ways is to cut across the very idea of having a plan or having a design, and to find a way through that paradox without somehow sidelining planners and designers and, if you like, paralyzing the very real creativity that you know, that students bring to those professions. I'm interested in the if you like, the theoretical phrases that you're bringing here, like the conditions of possibility and the idea of affordance, and I would probably add to that notions of a space of possibility and perhaps capacity. Do you have any comments on? I mean, I actually think that what you've done is to introduce, if you like, this paradox in some ways. But how do we do that and still catch the imagination of students, the design imagination for a better future, which is really where the revolutionary potential kind of lies in our field in some ways?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. It's a really good question and a tough one, because, you know, the easy thing for me to say would, that's, you know, over to you. This is. But you're right. I have some of my best friends are architects and planners, as we say. So, and I have spent a lot of time in these kinds of contexts. I think, you know, it partly goes back to the point that Samuel was raising earlier about the engagement of potential users, whether this is actual or in thinking about the user in having a degree of imagination around who the users might be of a space in time and over time, whether that time is the frame of a single day or whether you're thinking about a 20 to 30 year period, if as a designer you're lucky enough to be able to work with those kinds of time horizons and at that sort of scale. My sense is that actually quite a lot of this is already translated into design and planning practice. Most obviously when we're thinking about open and common and public spaces. So the design of public spaces, which are in principle open, lends itself to this more extended sense of openness over time, as well as permeability in a spatial sense. But we also see it in strategies around housing design. Obviously, the work of Elemental and Alejandro Aravena is a kind of a keystone in this sense. These not informal indeed. But they were drawing on repertoires of informal urbanism in order to design housing and sites which could then be built out by their inhabitants over time. And that kind of instance, and of course this was not invented by Elemental, but it's become very widely disseminated through their design practice. And we also see that in the work of designers like the Baugruppen in Germany or Naked House in the UK, that are using these kinds of strategies in order to provide often lower cost, often co-housing solutions, but housing designs which are unfinished, built to standard, but nonetheless can be inhabited in different ways by users over the short to the medium to the longer term. And then, of course, in the design of small-scale retail, of market-based spaces and so on, it also becomes possible. I'm not sure how we could think about this at the higher end of architecture and design and planning, at the master planning scale, or indeed through more corporate practices of design. But maybe that is not our primary concern if we're thinking about repertoires of informality, although of course I'm reminded of Alfredo's Torres in Caracas, the vertical slum, so-called, and the way in which this became that reality, even though it didn't start off as such.
Redden, can I have a brief follow-up? The phrases conditions of possibility and of affordance come from very different theoretical frameworks and backgrounds, right? Affordance really from Gibson and so on.
Yeah.
How do you see, what do you see as the most useful theoretical frameworks for rethinking and trying to embed this kind of thinking, particularly into the design professions?
God, I honestly do not know. How I would answer that. You've put me very much on the spot. I would not instance a particular theoretical framework, and I'm wondering if you might, or if others might. It might, in the interest of collaboration, this might be something to brainstorm.
Look, I'm happy to comment on more about where that comes from. It strikes me that affordance originally comes from psychology, but really needs to open up across a whole range of other areas. And I see conditions of possibility as primarily having a kind of Marxist political economy background. Spaces of possibility really is a DeLanda phrase from assemblage thinking. My own view is that these frameworks need to come together.
If they could, if they are reconcilable, and certainly the sense in which I see affordance as translating into this domain, it's traveling. I mean, it is taking on a different kind of sense, away from its origins in psychology. I mean, not that it becomes completely foreign to those. I do agree with you about the integration of these different perspectives, but they're not always reconcilable on the page, as a conceptual project. But that's not the most important place for them to reside. It may well be that these kinds of orientations on the part of designers and planners and these kinds of commitments are reconcilable in the field of practice, even though they might not get past peer review in a scholarly article as a consistent kind of conceptual framework.
Okay, thanks, Fran, and thanks, Kim, for asking those tough questions and providing additional insights. Okay, I think David Week also had some questions. David?
Hi, Fran, how are you? Thanks for that talk. I'm very interested in the way that it's very difficult for small traders to gain a foothold in the kind of richer parts of the city. And I was very fascinated by that early diagram you showed of the upper floors of a high street building being subdivided. In fact, I've seen very similar diagrams from Guangzhou, where it also happens. And what it seems I've seen over the last 20 years is that with, you know, what was originally guerrilla urbanism became tactical urbanism, and now around here it's just part of, you know, the repertoire of things that developers and traders do. There's companies that act as brokers between empty storefronts and people that want to set up short-term trading and so forth. I was just wondering whether you feel that overall there is this, let's say, a drift towards more flexible use of urban space. And secondly, whether there's any kind of, in addition to the kind of typological and qualitative analysis that you've talked about, whether there's some quantitative and economic analysis which demonstrates the impact that these kinds of moves have on inequality, on the overall economy, on poverty, and so forth. Because money talks. We're in a capitalist economy, and people listen when you can demonstrate that.
Yeah, thank you, David. That kind of hybrid emporium that Susie Hall was depicting there is extremely common in the city in which I live, London. You will find it on, I'm not saying on every high street in London, but certainly on the, you know, other than in the highest end parts of town. This is a very common strategy, retail strategy, occupation strategy, and it is one that to a greater or lesser degree is either permitted or is fostered by local planning authorities as well, who have, of course, quite a degree of leverage over how they permit use on a pro tem basis, or how they, you know, will okay certain things or not. In terms of the economic, I can't say about the impact on inequality. That I do not have any kind of data on, but there is certainly pretty good data on the economic impact, just in terms of the turnover of these kinds of spaces. And the, you know, and I think it's pretty observable from looking at that space that the number of people who are being employed in that retail shop front in all of these different functions, as compared to how many would be employed there if it was simply a single-use grocery store, is suggestive. The amount of footfall that comes through it as a consequence, and also the income that it generates. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and it is certainly greater than the single use would be, even though, you know, urban retail is pretty diverse in itself. I'm thinking of one happy story, given that I started off with John and feeling downbeat about COP. One good story from here in North London, and it's a site that we took our students to a few years ago, and some of you, I'm sure, I know Tanzil and others will certainly be familiar with it, is the Seven Sisters Market in North London, which was a sort of an empty retail space, which was owned by London Transport, actually, in the end, because it was previously owned by British Rail. It was on the side of a local rail station. They own a lot of public land and commercial space in the city, which helps, but it was publicly owned at least. And it was occupied over time by a number of small-scale market traders, largely from Latin America, but not solely, also from the Middle East and North Africa and from sub-Saharan Africa, but it was known as the Latin American market locally. And it was subject to a very long fight to keep it against a development plan from the local authority, which was going to establish retail, chain retail in its place. And we took our students there quite early on in this struggle for the city design studio that I work on. And it was very striking that this is a very international program. We British students are very rare birds. So most of the students are quite new to the UK and to London, and a number of the students were very taken aback that these kinds of spaces existed in London. So people who are coming from Quito, who of course took to it immediately, had been unaware that they were going to find these kinds of spaces, and you find them all over the place. The good news end of that story is that they have actually prevailed, that the council has done a U-turn. The developers finally have lost interest because it's not going to be developable with this degree of protest, and they are going to come up with an alternative design. So that form of insurgency in this case, in fact, and that sort of patient occupation over time has for now paid off. The story is not over. Alongside the economic value, of course, the social value of a space of that kind can be quantified through various kinds of measures, but cannot be underestimated at the same time. But the planners have a very crucial role in this, in terms of being creative in the use of leasing and licensing to allow irregular patterns of use, which are productive and which are socially generative.
Okay, thanks, David and Fran. So guys, it's already 7:04, but Fran has agreed to stay with us until 7:10. So I think we can still take one or two last questions. But guys, if you need to leave, feel free to drift off, but we will go on with probably two last questions. And one of those questions would be from Merrick, who cannot speak because he's currently on a busy street. So I'll just read out his question. I'm hoping to get Fran's opinion as to whether urban informality, as it comprises impermanence, insurgency, and other processual, is akin to Bauman's conception of liquid modernity.
Thank you, Merrick. I don't know if Merrick's still on the call, but I'm very envious of being on a busy street, I have to say. And I also like the processual eyes. Yes, I was very conscious of the alliteration. I guess it is akin to Bauman's conception of liquid modernity, to throw in another theoretical framework alongside the ones that Kim and I were essaying before. It's not something which informs my own. I mean, obviously, I'm very familiar with Bauman's work on this as a sociologist. It's not something that informs my own thinking in this area, because I guess in a way Bauman's work has this more epochal quality rather than the sense of immediacy that I would be more concerned to interrogate. But I can certainly see the affinities with it, and I think if it's something that is helpful to think with, then it's something to be taken up. I mean, you know, these theoretical frameworks are about what we can do with them, how they help us to think, rather than whether we're being strictly accurate in how we apply them or translate them, I would say. But thank you for the processual eyes, Merrick.
Okay, so again, Merrick, thanks for that question. Any more questions, guys? We still have 4 minutes left. Okay, then I'll probably ask the last question, Fran. So for me, these idioms of informality are really very insightful, but I was wondering how or to what extent these idioms of informality unsettle or reshape power relations in different urban contexts, whether you're talking about global South or global North urban communities, like based on your own engagement with probably some of the empirical insights in northern cities.
Well, they, in and of themselves, they involve power relations, and there are various kinds of power move involved. And I think your question, Redden, comes back very nicely to close the circle with John's opening question, that it's whether we are talking about more sort of systemic change, or whether we are talking about the kinds of small acts that can make changes, meaningful changes in people's everyday lives now or for the time being. And I'm reminded again of Colin McFarlane's closing conclusions when he contrasted the sort of reformist approaches to remaking the crowd and urban densities. And in fact, it included, some of these gestures of what I've called idioms of informality being used by planners and policymakers, cycle lanes, street closures, and so on. And then he contrasted that with this more transformational approach, which was going to try and remake some of the, or redress some of the underlying inequalities which were producing these variable patterns of density. I'm always hesitant. I mean, notwithstanding my Marxist commitments to the conditions of possibility, I'm always hesitant to make claims about large-scale systemic changes, but I think the route to them is always going to be through small acts and minor acts and forms of organization and mobilization. The ones we've just been discussing, the climate protesters, and the ways in which these remake space and try to make claims to power, even if it's only for the hour that you can occupy that intersection, or if it's for the 2 years that you can occupy a site. These things are consequential, even if they are seen as provisional or impermanent. So yes, power runs through all of this. And I think that some of the risk and one of the paradoxes of this kind of informal urbanism is that within the design disciplines, obviously our eye gets drawn to what I've called those more camera-ready approaches to informal urbanism in rich world cities, that very knowingly draw on conventions of design that often involve people with design training and so on. And this can seem quite sort of anesthetic or anodyne or, ready for co-optation. But I don't think that should detract from the very important claim that it is the users of space who are actually, that design is an effect of use and an outcome of use. And I mean, I don't want to close without saying how much I admire the work that is coming out of the hub there in Melbourne, and how interesting I am to see it develop, and the kinds of principles that I know that you're seeking to generate out of the research to see how they come out. And I see this as a good example of that, of actually following the users and following the practice in order to generate knowledge and to inform planning rather than the other way around, and working at quite a significant scale.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Fran. And I think we're right on time. So guys, again, join me in thanking Professor Fran Tonkiss for her very fascinating lecture, for engaging with our questions, very interesting questions. And thank you everyone for joining us today and for participating in our previous webinars this 2021. So we're going to upload the recorded version of this session and send it out to you guys so you could share it with your friends and colleagues who were unable to join us today. Okay, so
thank you. Thanks, Redden. And I must just underline from the chat that Ash has importantly referred us to Tim Ingold's work on affordance, which is, in case you missed it, is a really good cue. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks, Fran, and thanks, Ash, for that insight. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.